going to start recording here. I'm here with Raven, who I think was part of the wave of subscribers who came in when I wrote a couple of articles on sexuality, Hawk Tuah, and incels, and people really liked that. There were some things there that I was really kind of surprised with how much people resonated with it, as opposed to my dry historical writing, which is like 1,000 years ago, and which I really resonate with. I'm like, I can imagine being there and whatever, but no, people are, this is people's real experiences. These are people's real lives. And I think I kind of hit a chord in a good way, rather than, I think a lot of the discourse online about men and women is sort of like trollish, acrimonious, resentful. And I've fallen prey to it. I'm not invulnerable to that. But when I'm kind of doing these long form things, I try to be thoughtful and empathetic. So was there anything, so maybe we don't have to focus on those two, but I guess, like, what was the biggest takeaway that you had, or the thing that you resonated with most? Doesn't have to be those two articles, but let me know what's hitting.
I think I find, okay, so when I found your writing, I got like extremely excited. The most excited that I've been in a very, very long time about content that I've found on the internet. I think whatever you're doing is bringing ideas together in a way that at least makes me laugh, and also have a cascade of insights that feel like they're from a vantage point that's not the kind of normal positions of social critique or analysis. So when I came across the Hawk Tuah piece, and then later on I read about, I don't remember the name that you gave this article, but it was like...
Politics is Astrology for Incels? Was that the one?
No, it was the one that you wrote about hoarders and like the
hoarders. Oh, was that the working class white people? And yeah. Yeah, that was I think a lot of people, like, so if I scroll back in my history, I grew up basically with like classist prejudices. So and that's something that when you start checking out the different sides of the left, you realize that now people are realizing that like liberals have those classist prejudices, and they're like, wait, we need to go back to the original left where we were like all about the working class. And so like, how dare you call someone a redneck, or how dare you call someone white trash? But that was not an examined contradiction in my life growing up. That was just a cultural or socioeconomic prejudice that I had, and it was more difficult. I really had that lived experience. So maybe I don't know what other people's experience is, but growing up, like, I deeply believed that like the average George Bush voter was ruining the country, and they were responsible for all of the problems, and George Bush was a war criminal. But at the same time, like, if someone asked me to describe those people, I would have said, oh, they're dumb, they're poor, they're uneducated, whatever. And if someone said, like, well, don't you think we need to help them? And I was like, well, first we need to like burn down their churches. And then like once they've thrown out their Bibles, then we can help them. Like, first they need to submit, and they need to sort of be humiliated or humbled. And that attitude, as I came to this, because I was like a radical atheist and very militant. And when I started to study religions to try to figure this big problem out, I realized, like, okay, well, I don't believe in God, but I am effectively a religious person. Like, I'm on a crusade. I got up in front of my class and I was like, we need to abolish religion. And like, I was doing all of this with the same kind of fervor that, on the other hand, they would say, well, you guys need to get rid of your atheism and adopt Christianity. So that was kind of an interesting moment for me. It didn't like solve the problem. It didn't make me it didn't like make me an agnostic or like a religiously neutral person. But it did make me start to think like, okay, there's some kind of deeper psychology going on here. There's some kind of tribalism that I thought I was the most universalistic person in the world. I thought I was the most liberal person in the world. But there was this kind of like almost racism or something within me. Like you could say, oh, okay, we're all white people, but it's like, okay, maybe genetically or something like that. But culturally, I felt like these were two different races. Like I'm of the liberal race, they're of the conservative race. We don't, increasingly the statistics reflect that like these two groups of people don't want to marry each other. They don't want to have kids together. They don't want to really live in the same states or the same communities. And then I started to expand that analysis to, okay, like what about other groups of people, and try to figure that out. And I'm still trying to figure that out. So it's not a solved problem from my vantage point of figuring out like, who are we? What are our values? What is our religion? And I think that's the reason why we're constantly talking about our values is because we don't know what they are. So it's like, if we understood what our values were, we wouldn't have to constantly use that phrase. But because that's a point of anxiety in our culture, we don't know what they are, and therefore people kind of endlessly drone on about these platitudes because it's hitting this point of anxiety. Like people want us to have strong values, and we don't because there's so much disagreement or division within society that, again, predates or is aside from racial divisions or other sorts of things that maybe are, I would say, like secondary or proceed from this kind of liberal conservative divide. So I don't know how personal we're going to get, but I just wanted to kind of ask you, growing up, do you feel like there was any sort of, I don't even know if you grew up in Sweden, but if you did, was there any sort of divide like that in your young adulthood? And if so, when did you start to perceive that?
Yeah, totally. I grew up in the US. I'm American. My father is Irish from Northern Ireland. He was Protestant, raised Protestant, although I have an Irish Catholic last name. So his father's lineage actually goes back to Irish Catholics, but his mother's are Scottish Protestants. My mother was American, and she went there and met him. They got pregnant with me, went back to the US. So I live in Europe now because I have dual citizenship. But I was raised in the United States, and I identify as being American, and I feel very American. That's what my European friends tell me as well. So most of my upbringing was on the West Coast, which is a very strange culture, very dominated by leftist subcultures. So I grew up in a town, Olympia, Washington, one of the important places for like the punk movement, right? So I grew up in a radical left community. So it was very taboo, the red state, the parts of the state, the rednecks and the people who lived in the rural parts of the state, and those people who came to my school and they drove trucks, and that was the aesthetic that was definitely off limits. I remember at the point when I was rebelling against my mother, who was very, very left-wing, like I would even say she was on the level of like an eco-fascist. I started to be very, very curious about those people. I was like, who the fuck are these guys driving around in these monster trucks with the balls hanging off the back? Like what, what is going on here? And, the big unraveling for me was actually on the level of environmentalism. My mother was an environmentalist. That's part of the eco-fascism. She really thought that we needed to use like militant power to enforce a future that was going to preserve the ecology of the planet. And, the right wingers, whatever, represented the total opposite of that. They love driving their oil guzzling trucks, and they take pleasure in kind of like flipping the finger to environmentalists like my mother. But I started questioning some of these ideas of nature. I started reading literature that questioned these ideas, the idea of like an invasive species or like this ideal of a kind of Holocene Earth that's preserved in natural parks, in these national parks, and like kept in this pristine state that's actually like kind of frozen within the context of evolutionary time and geological time. So these frames started to break, and I started to become much more interested in eating meat, for example. I started eating meat. I was raised vegetarian. And then I started thinking about, okay, well, what are the ways to eat meat in a way that is ecologically and kind of spiritually conscious, and started to get interested in hunting. And so these types of things brought me closer to rural populations, people who have an understanding of how to use weapons, and people who are hunters, and people who do have an intimate relationship with the land, but they also have other types of aesthetic and political values that are very off-putting to urbanized liberals, and especially notions of masculinity. But I was very curious, and I have been very, very curious about that kind of class of people since 2016, basically, when the election happened, and that group of people seemed to become more prominent as a populist force. I started getting really, really interested in who they were and how they thought. And I think my leftist values of like inclusion actually meant that I was genuinely attempting to understand who the outgroup was from my perspective, from my like political camp's perspective. But when I ended up kind of wormholing into that world, and now I'm like coming back out again and finding some, I don't know, new vantage point. Because at the end of the day, I think there is quite a lot that remains alienating to someone like me about that culture. And I can't really swallow it at the end of the day. But there's a lot more commonality than there was at the beginning of this process. A lot of my prejudices have gone away. And I now have new prejudices for the left. So, yeah, that's kind of the TLDR, my story there.
Yeah, I would say that I started thinking pretty seriously about this um, around 2009. I don't have like a diary from that period, but I got very into libertarianism, um, and I think it was, I'm not sure what specifically triggered that, but one of the arguments that was very convincing to me is that organized religion is a form of herd mentality. You're a sheep. You're just following this leader, and people should think for themselves. They should think critically. And government to me seemed to be a secular form, and patriotism. Like, I was never a patriot. This is before even like nationalism was even a word that people would use in common discourse. But I was like, no, I'm not a patriot. I didn't even have the term globalist, but I was just like, no, I'm sort of like, I care about all peoples. I'm a global citizen or something. And my loyalty is basically to science. And I thought, well, just as science has this conflict with religion, science also has this conflict with government, because we believe that, for instance, democracy. I mean, that was kind of my first thing where I started to have a problem, was like, okay, the majority of America is religious. I don't want that to be the case. How are we going to change that if we have a democracy? If people just vote, for George W. Bush at the time, and later Obama, I was like, how do we as a country evolve, and how are we led in the correct direction if we're not led by people who are experts in their field, people who are scientific? If it's just a popularity contest, I think I was always opposed to that, because I knew I would never win a popularity contest. I was too, acerbic, and I was too sarcastic, and I thought I was too arrogant. I thought I was the smartest kid in the room all the time. And so I knew, like, okay, well, I'm never going to win the Democratic popularity contest. And that was part of the appeal of libertarianism for me, is that it was like, no, you don't need to be the most popular. You just need to be smart and figure things out and have the truth on your side, and then the market will reward you. And the only reason we don't have this perfect meritocracy is this government corruption and cronyism. So I think those were the attitudes that led me to libertarianism. And then, but once you're there, then you start to realize, like, okay, I on these economic issues, I seem to have more in common with these conservatives than these liberals. And that's where I started to feel like, well, both camps are, there's bad people on both sides, basically. And that was kind of the period where I was just like, okay, I'm again, we didn't have that term populism. Again,